Welcome to History Secrets Uncovered. My name is Jay Chandarana, and today I have the honor of speaking with Professor Adam Laats, a historian of education, culture, and politics in the United States. He teaches at Binghamton University, where his work focuses on the history of religion, conservatism, and the culture wars in American schools. He's the author of Fundamentalist You, Keeping the Faith in American Higher Education and the Other School Reformers, Conservative Activism in American Education, both of which explore how debates over faith, ideology, and schooling have shaped the nation. Today, we'll talk about why schools have so often been at the center of cultural conflict, how the struggles of the past echo in today's education debates, and what this history reveals about American democracy itself. Thank you so much for being here today and taking your time to speak with me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's great to talk with you, Jay.
Before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about what actually first drew you into history of education and these culture wars?
Sure. For me, there's no better way to understand the sort of oops, sorry, I lost a I lost a paper cup on my desk. There's no better way to understand unofficial America than to look at the institutions where things happen. And schools are a great one. So, for example, Americans from all backgrounds like to talk about schools as a place to, get knowledge, get ready for a career or for college. But really, schools are way more complicated and way more connected to the things people don't like to say out loud. Like, for example, um, schools are not one thing in America, but a million things. If you go to school in one town versus another, you have a very different experience. So for me, looking at the ways looking at the way questions of things like citizenship and race and religion and gender, looking at the way those play out in schools is a way to get into conversations that people don't want to say out loud.
That's that's definitely really interesting. And I know that previously, before you became a historian, you taught at a middle and high school. How did that experience shape the way you think about your research now?
Yeah, it's huge, and it's a great question. I think education policy is kind of unusual in that you have a lot of people who think they know about it because they like went to school, and that's ridiculous. You wouldn't have someone doing a surgery because like once they had that surgery, it's like no, um, being an adult working in a school for 10 years, secondary school for 10 years, I think it gives people like me better insight into the way schools really work. Not just the way people talk about the way schools should work, but the way they really work.
And have you seen a difference in how different school districts handle the same issues?
Oh, absolutely. So, I did my teaching in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and way before any of this current round of debates about critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was a district, um, I don't know, about a rural district in Wisconsin that literally the school board banned people in the school, students and teachers, from using phrases like white privilege.
Oh,
And
wow.
this is before President Trump was elected. This is before most of us in schools thought about things like critical race theory. Um, and that school was about 45 minutes from the school I was teaching in, and it was a world away, So in one way to look at it, the schools were super similar on paper, but because of the towns that they were in, the communities that they worked with, they were light years apart.
Yeah. And and now when you see modern headlines about schools in the news, what makes you think this is something different and new versus what makes you think we've been here before? As you were just saying, even years before, you've seen these conversations about critical race theory and white privilege.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing new about ugly fights for control of schools, with schools acting as a stand-in, control of schools acting as a stand-in for, who counts as a quote unquote real American. So I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing that US schools were legally segregated by race until 1954. And then for a long time after that, even if it became illegal, public schools are still incredibly segregated by race and by
Yeah.
income. And that's always been the case, all the way back to, the days of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. That's how American schools in the U.S. have always been. One thing that's really different, though, is in especially the last, whatever it's been, 8 months of the current presidential administration, things really have changed in
Yeah.
schools, like with everything else, because, a president can't abolish the Department of Education, but in practice, this one has.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, like a lot of other things, whether you love President Trump or hate him, he has this current second administration has changed all the rules because it's basically thrown the rule book out. So this is new. This is the fights are kind of similar, but having someone in the Oval Office taking such an extreme stand, that's really new.
Yeah. And kind of seeing the shift, is there still a stark contrast between how public schools and private schools are approaching these issues under Trump's presidency? Or is this, I guess, change that's very recent, just in the last eight months, really affecting schools across the board, whether it be like private or public?
No, it's for everyone. So it's in different ways though. So most private schools, not all, but a lot of private schools are what they call scholarship generating organizations, SGOs. And this gets really dorky, so apologies. Um, the current Big Budget Act, the Big Beautiful Bill Act, as it's called, which is working toward reconciliation in the Congress. It includes a super dramatic school funding measure, $1,700 per taxpaying person could be taken out of everybody's federal taxes and sent to a private school that you prefer, and maybe any school you prefer. So for private schools,
Got it. Yeah.
you could have this revolution in funding where suddenly, if they convince enough people to send them $1,700 each, they could be flush with cash in a way that a lot of them, especially like religious schools, like Catholic schools, they never have enough money. Some private schools are very rich, but a lot of them aren't. This could make a whole new world of private education funded by these $1,700 per person SGO accounts.
Yeah.
Public schools too. What we're seeing in public schools is not all that different from what we're seeing in other current issues like abortion rights. It's starting to become much more dramatically state by state. If you live in New York, like you and me, the state government is committed and seems like for the future it will be committed to a certain vision of well-funded public schooling. If you live in Oklahoma or Florida or Texas, those states, the state governments have been dedicated to defunding public education and putting more funding into private schooling.
Got
So
it.
just like with abortion rights, instead of it being a nationwide thing, it seems like we're standing on this very unusual brink of people in New York having one public school experience and people in Florida having a very different one.
Yeah, definitely. And even from my own personal experience, where I go to Scarsdale High School, a very good public school that I know that even private schools that like I guess have a tendency to boast like a better education, a higher quality education, sometimes don't even compete with the type of schooling that we get in certain areas in New York. Whereas it makes sense, places that are kind of pushing away that funding from public schools would definitely have a completely different schooling experience.
Hmm.
And on a different note, in your book, The Other School Reformers, you highlight how conservative activists reshaped the meaning of school reform. What do you think most Americans don't understand or misunderstand about conservative visions of education?
It's a great question. There's a lot of different, as many different conservative visions as there are progressive or liberal visions. But I think one of the things that makes a lot of conservative education activists love President Trump is that there's a core feeling among many conservatives that school needs to be a place where traditional values, as they define them, are reinforced, not challenged.
Yeah.
So when you see some of President Trump's, recent statements about, you know, um, museums that focus too much on the bad parts of slavery,
Yeah.
it sounds kind of bonkers. I mean, of course slavery was bad, but in his unique, reality TV way, President Trump is articulating this vision that a lot of Americans share, that the point of school isn't to make you challenge your family beliefs, but rather to reinforce those beliefs. So, if you grow up in a religious family, a lot of conservatives think of school as the place that should be teaching kids why those traditional ideas are right, instead of what they think is happening, which is teaching kids that traditional ideas are wrong.
And and in a country of such diversity like America, how do how do schools handle that? Where not every student might be Christian and not might not want to see like the Ten Commandments hung up in public schools. How would that challenge be navigated?
Right? This is a great, and it's not just that conservative religious activists are trying to put Christian stuff in schools. It's even more complicated because the Supreme Court recently decided that in favor of a group of conservative religious parents of different faiths. There was Muslim, Orthodox Christian, and one other family of a different faith group that I forget, and they objected to the mandatory use of these books that had positive depictions of LGBTQ characters and themes.
Mm,
So it's a really challenging decision for schools because what schools tend to do is just kind of muddle through.
yeah.
If a family gets mad about something, the school principal sits down with them, they work out a solution. The Supreme Court basically just said, no, if a parent has a religious beef with school, the school has to do what they want, which is an incredibly difficult thing for any school to do. So if you have a religious beef with if some family has a religious beef with a Christian Ten Commandments, it seems like a Supreme Court just said the school would have to get rid of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
And yet it's a conservative court, and many conservatives want those Ten Commandments. So I think it's way too complicated to say simply that schools are going to get more or less conservative under this administration. I think we're all going to be a lot more, all school people are going to be a lot more confused for a while about what is and isn't allowable.
Yeah. And in another one of your books, Fundamentalist you describe how evangelical colleges try to balance faith and intellectual life. How do these colleges balance both? And do you see this tension between faith and academic authority as unique to evangelicals or part of a wider American struggle? I know you touched on some of this with like the Muslim and other families, but specifically within evangelical colleges.
Yeah, well, in U.S. Culture and history, evangelical Protestantism has this unique status as a lot of conservative evangelicals think of themselves as sort of like the core American religion, and they're not. There's always been a mix of religions in the United States. But that's like a core belief. And I think that's why slogans like Make America Great Again are so powerful among some conservative evangelicals, because they see the past as a time that they had more prominence. Um, Evangelical colleges 100 years ago started saying, hey, I guess we're not as in charge of America as we thought, and we need to be separate. And that is 100% American. I mean, pretty much every faith group has had that experience. Among Christians, the Catholic Church has had that experience among Christians. I'm sorry, among in America.
Yeah.
All different types of Judaism have had similar experience, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Muslims from different backgrounds, Hindus from different backgrounds, Buddhists. There's been a real shared experience in America of feeling like um, this this isn't our country. We're just living here.
Yeah.
And so certainly when it comes to schooling and higher ed, there has been a very strong tradition of every faith group of feeling the need to somehow take college and make it safe for quote unquote our kids. So every faith group has like chaplains on campuses, for example.
Yeah.
Pretty much every student, every uh, large college has student groups from every different religious group. So, no, I think that's a very widespread American thing for college to feel like we need our faith represented in this college, even if it's a public or a state school.
Yeah. And speaking on the history of urban school reform, as like in the past, these evangelical Christians had more prominence. What does that story reveal about the broader relationship between education, democracy, and inequality in the United States?
Yeah, it's a tough one because, and it's a sobering story because it really forces you to recognize how as we started talking our discussion today, school can work as a stand-in for American society.
Yeah.
It's sobering to realize how segregated by race schools were, and still are in a lot of ways, and then also by income. So schools have always been this promise of an opportunity for everyone. And for a lot of people, like my dad came to this country with nothing. It was public school that allowed him to become a rocket scientist at MIT.
Wow.
People can do that. However, the American story implies that everybody can do that. And we all know it's just not true. American
Yeah.
schools have always been um, just as divided as the rest of American society.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because it's true for my family as well. I mean, both my parents came to the United States not with much, and they both made it well using this American school system. But like you're saying, I mean, I know countless examples where that's not true, where even though this ideal American dream is that everyone could go to college and everyone could make a name for themselves, at some point it's not feasible for that to apply to everybody. Yeah,
And it's a tough one. It's just like you said, like some towns and cities, Scarsdale, New York famously has super well-funded public schools, and that's
yeah,
great. But you don't have to go far from Scarsdale to get into America's largest school district, New York City school district, and the students there have wildly different experiences, not just even in the same city, block to block, family to family. You can go to a school like, Bronx Science or whatever, Stuyvesant, and these like amazing public schools. Or you can go to these underfunded public schools that um, just don't offer the same educational experience in the same city.
yeah. Like you're saying, I mean, especially in the city, in New York City itself, you could go really 5 blocks and see complete two completely different views of what that school system would look like, which is definitely really interesting to think about.
Right.
Um, and kind of shifting focus, and nowadays in school, it's a stem for larger conflicts over morality, citizenship, and democracy. School is a place where many of these debates take place and many ideas start to form for the youth. Why do you think school becomes such a powerful symbol for these struggles?
Yeah, school, not just school, but control of the school that your children go to. That has always been, from British colonial days all the way till 2025, that's always been a stand-in for sort of like unofficial, real citizenship. So I sometimes ask, and people ask like, why are some parents so angry about, these books that they don't like in schools, these books with positive depictions of LGBTQ characters. If they don't like them, why don't they just ignore it? Or people will say, do they not know that their kids can get every book like in on their phone? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
do they not know? I don't think that's the point. I think the point is control of school has stood in for hundreds of years as a symbol of being a, quote unquote real American. And some people are so invested in their definition of what a real American is that the idea of like an LGBTQ person being considered just as real as a heterosexual person, like they can't stand that idea.
Yeah.
So schools, white and black, indigenous and Anglo, they've always um, been a marker of who gets considered to be a true, quote unquote, true citizen. And that's why it becomes such a fight.
And and do you think this control of schools is also about a control over the youth and as a way for in more conservative areas to push more conservative ideals, whereas in more liberal areas to push more liberal ideals to the students?
Absolutely. The idea that um, schools are the thing that defines what young people think, like you just have to be a young person or have been a young person once to know how ridiculous that is.
Hmm.
School isn't the thing that makes teenagers believe the things they do. It's one influence,
Yeah.
but I mean, young people demographically, and this isn't just an opinion, this is demographic truth, they're less racist and more accepting of LGBTQ identities than their parents as a whole, not individually. There's plenty of racist young people still, but
Yeah.
as groups, young people are less racist and more accepting than their parents. Schools don't cause that, but schools are an easy target for people who don't like that. People who
Yeah.
don't like that can, it's hard for them to get up there and say, hey, we're mad about this vague social trend, but it's easy for them to get up there and say, hey, we're mad at the school board, which is you 9 people. So schools stand in for some conservatives as like at the sort of um, cause of social change, which is not fair, but it's understandable.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially because school is a place where you meet new people and you could be confronted with new ideas and new ways of thinking. But to blame school isn't the right solution, as as it is to just understand. Growing up, you're likely to meet new people and likely to face new ways of thinking.
Absolutely.
And and in your own opinion, after years of studying these battles in the education system, how has your view of American education changed?
This might sound bonkers, but I used to think that Americans were super starkly divided because I mean literally people fight in the streets about these issues and they fight at school boards and they physically fight, it generates a lot of heat and anger. I think though the core of it is that Americans of whatever political background, whatever, personal background, Americans agree more than we disagree about schools. We all want good education for our children. That's huge. I mean, it's obvious, but
Yeah.
it's also huge. What we don't agree on is pretty important. Like what does good mean? We don't agree on that, but we all want our kids to be safe. We all want our kids to have a quality education. I feel like there's more that we agree upon than we disagree upon.
I think that's interesting because it is true. I mean, regardless if you're a parent, a very conservative parent, a very liberal parent, your goal is never to have a bad education for your child. Every parent wants the best for their kid. But it is true, like you said, what that good education looks like might be what's very, very different between these two groups.
Right? Everybody wants their kids to be safe and they want their kid to get a good education. But some parents think that it's unsafe for their kids to learn about LGBTQ issues. Other parents think it's unsafe if their kids don't learn about LGBTQ issues. And that's what we're fighting about. However, I think if we can focus the fight on the real issues, safety and quality, focus the discussion on those things, we actually have huge areas of agreement.
Yeah. And what do you hope policymakers, educators, or even parents might take away from your research when thinking about the future of American schools?
Uh, it's an investment, and it's the best investment. Schools are something that more than roads, more than ports, more than AI data farms. Schools are the thing in historical terms that made the United States into what it is. So it hurts me as just a person to see like research universities being attacked. And again, not even politically, just as a sort of American taxpayer, it
Yeah.
makes no sense to attack one of America's like strongest international things that took about 150 years at this point to build. So I think I would love all of us Americans to say schools are the biggest thing we can and should invest in. All kinds of schools. The more people that have more and better education, the better we all are. Even if it's not our own kids, it's still worth our money to invest in education for everybody.
Thank you so much for that. That was really insightful. I really appreciate that.